I am presenting a co-authored book chapter, which is entitled Understanding Intersectionality in Vulnerable Populations, a Missing Part in Building Disaster Resilient Communities. I am Crystal Whetstone, and my co-author is Fatih Demirose. We are both at Sam Houston State University, and this was a collaborative effort on our part. So Fatih is a very well-established public administrations scholar, and then I do work in comparative politics, and I am very familiar with intersectionality. So we brought our two skill sets together for this co-authored chapter. So this is our abstract, which I've already shared with the panel, but I will just move right into the outline and what I'll be covering today on behalf of myself and Fatih. So we just are going to introduce our research questions, our arguments, go over the literature review, and then do our review of how intersectionality is used in crisis and related literatures. So in terms of the purpose of this chapter, it's really to explore what we see as the slow but growing inclusion of intersectionality in crisis management scholarship, and to contribute to scholarly efforts to bridge crisis management and intersectionality literatures. So intersectionality is essentially an analytical framework that analyzes the overlapping and compounding oppressions and/or privileges of people. And our research question in this chapter is, what does the lens of intersectionality do for crisis management, and how can intersectionality as a framework be used to address vulnerable and marginalized populations in building disaster resilient communities? And what we argue is that intersectionality as a framework can make considerable contributions to our understanding of vulnerable and marginalized populations in crisis management, and that by focusing only on a single attribute of a person, such as race, gender, socioeconomic status, or whatever, it creates blind spots for our understanding of vulnerability and marginality, which can really differ greatly among these different subcategories. And what we're suggesting is that scholars and policymakers take these interactions of these different attributes into account in their research and in their policies. So crisis management literature has a number of key terms to be familiar with. One of these is resilience. And so building resilient communities has really become a large part of not just the political agenda in the US, but globally as well over recent decades. And so from the crisis and related kind of literatures, what resilience is understood as is a social system and its capacity to proactively adapt to and recover from unexpected disturbances. And so social systems consist of an array of different kind of actors and different kinds of considerations. So this would be all of the actors and populations within a community, the strategies that actors deploy, interactions including networks and social capital, thinking about the rules and the norms, including these sort of informal norms that govern these interactions, the artifacts or the things that exist within a social system, the environment itself, and then the feedback loops which exist in this. So we also have to think about vulnerability and marginality. So we have used the definition of vulnerability as socioeconomic characteristics that influence a community's ability to prepare, respond, cope, and recover from a hazard event, and marginality as emerging from unequal relationships between one or several groups with power, whether economic, political, social, or altogether in a minority or non-members of that said community. Intersectionality is a framework, as we have already discussed. It has a feminist genealogy, and so it really comes from Black feminists who previously discussed the concept of what is intersectionality as the double burden, the triple jeopardy, or triple oppression. It's Kimberly Crenshaw who coins the term intersectionality in the late 1980s, and really intersectional analysis is able to shed light on differences among and within various sectors of society. And so what intersectionality can do is look at these embedded structural violences and the overlapping forms of marginalization that exist within there, rather than looking at things piece by piece. And so Fatih and I, we understand that this can assist crisis management scholars and practitioners to better assess risk and to promote resiliency in crisis and disaster preparation by explicating those differences that exist among various sectors of the so-called vulnerable and marginalized. So we discussed gender mainstreaming because this really comes about at the same time as intersectionality. And so gender mainstreaming works to bring equal opportunities, equal treatment, women's perspective, gendered perspectives, or more recently, diversity into research and or policy making to ensure equal outcomes. So we see this whole area of literature that comes up in sort of crisis and disaster management known as gender and disaster. And so this simply considers gender in disaster planning, management, and research through gender mainstreaming. But there are some critiques of how gender mainstreaming tends to homogenize and essentialize women and kind of treat them, ethnocentrically as victims. And there's other issues too, right? And the fact that gender mainstreaming can leave out other marginalized groups, right, that aren't marginalized by gender, but are marginalized by other factors. So when we think about this and looking specifically at the crisis management and related literatures, we see that the field of crisis management has started to recognize intuitively and explicitly the need for intersectionality in assessing resilience among vulnerable populations. However, the field as a whole could do much better in applying intersectionality to whether, that's scholarship or in policy making. So it was really interesting in reviewing some of this literature. So Weisner and Luce, as early as 1993, they're focusing on this need to accurately identify and assess the risk of vulnerable populations, and noting that there's variety within this, depending on what populations are being assessed. And so they emphasize how vulnerable populations face more risk than less marginalized group, and they call for what they term applied vulnerability analysis to crises. And so they have this really interesting construction of like poor women, class plus gender, old poor women, so age plus class plus gender, etc., etc. So they're not drawing upon Kimberly Crenshaw or any other kind of intersectionality scholars or even some of that early work, but there's like this intuitive understanding of we need to have that kind of an approach. So since the 2000s, a growing area of research on crisis and disaster management for the most vulnerable does sometimes mention overlapping oppressions, which comes out of intersectionality scholarship, and sometimes it even brings up the usefulness of intersectionality analysis. But there's not a tremendous amount of studies that actually apply this, although again, it's that growing recognition. So we do find a growing number of studies that are actually applying intersectional analysis. And so just to show you how this can be important, Vickery did a study in Boulder, Colorado, looking at unhoused individuals who experienced the 2013 Colorado floods and used intersectional analysis. And what Vickery argues is that disaster management studies often paint the vulnerable with a really broad brush without thinking about how intersecting traits and contextual factors result in unequal disaster and environmental outcomes. And so really, to sum up, we echo some other scholars who have used intersectionality in crisis and disaster management literature, who argue that only intersectionality is what allows researchers to understand differences within particular social groups and to recognize that vulnerability also shifts by context. So the contexts themselves are dynamic. And we are just suggesting that intersectionality becomes a useful perspective to assess vulnerability as this dynamic phenomenon. And so I'll just give you a short example from the Boulder study that Vickery did. Looking at the unhoused, they actually found out that many unhoused individuals felt like they were doing better than those who were housed in the aftermath of the floods because they already had experience of living as an unhoused person. And so this provides agency, and it also highlights agency, and it just kind of takes the focus off of just sort of victimizing people who have particular vulnerabilities and marginalizations, to show that they do have a skill set, and it's important to highlight that, and intersectionality does that, among many other things. But I just want to end it here in the thinking about time.